The air inside the top-floor executive boardroom of Pierce Global Enterprises was thick with tension, the heavy silence broken only by the rhythmic tapping of a diamond ring against the polished mahogany table. Samantha Pierce, the billionaire chief executive officer, whose reputation for ruthless efficiency was known across 3 continents, stared down at the ancient, yellowed manuscript that had just been laid before her by a delegation of stone-faced international investors. Beside her, the company's recently appointed vice president of engineering, a polished and impeccably tailored man named Julian Vance, cleared his throat and confidently declared that the handwritten technical document was completely unreadable, a useless historical artifact written in a dead, unidentifiable dialect that no modern computer program or university scholar could decipher. It was at that exact moment that Nathan Cole, a quiet warehouse logistics clerk, wearing a faded canvas uniform and carrying a plastic clipboard of inventory sheets, stepped into the room to deliver the morning shipping manifests and caught a brief glimpse of the text over Samantha's shoulder. In his characteristic low, steady voice, Nathan quietly remarked to himself that the text wasn't a dead language at all, but rather an obsolete late 18th century regional dialect of Upper Saxon metallurgy shorthand. Samantha turned her head sharply, a stressed and defensive reflex causing her to let out a mockingly sharp, condescending laugh that echoed off the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, telling the humble clerk that if he could actually translate a document that had baffled their entire global research team, she would personally pay his entire annual salary out of her own pocket. Nathan did not hesitate. He calmly set down his clipboard, adjusted his glasses, and began to read the fluid script aloud with absolute precision, translating the complex chemical ratios and thermal tempering sequences line by line. The chief foreign investor froze in absolute shock, his fingers trembling so violently that his heavy crystal water glass slipped from his grasp, plummeting to the table and shattering into hundreds of glittering shards that showered across the multi-billion-dollar corporate blueprints. To find out how a forgotten clerk holding a plastic clipboard managed to upend a $3 billion corporate empire and stun the executives who dismissed him, stay until the very end. Before we look back at how this incredible moment came to be, if stories about honest, hard-working individuals who find their true worth recognized after years of silence touch your heart, please take a brief moment to share your thoughts in our community comments below, as we gather here every week to honor the quiet heroes among us. It truly makes one wonder whether the modern corporate world has become so obsessed with expensive degrees and polished titles that it has completely lost the ability to recognize the raw, practical genius of the people who actually keep the gears turning. 14 months earlier, the echoing corridors of the Pierce Global Shipping Terminal offered a much slower, quieter pace of life for Nathan Cole. Every morning at exactly 5 o'clock, long before the sun had begun to burn away the thick gray mist that rolled off the industrial docks, Nathan could be found in the chilly depths of Warehouse Sector 4, his calloused hands methodically scanning barcodes and organizing heavy wooden crates. At 42 years old, Nathan was a man defined by stillness and observation. He spoke only when spoken to, never raised his voice even during peak shipping crises, and possessed an uncanny ability to notice the slightest microfracture in a shipping container or the minor calibration error in a forklift engine. To the rest of the blue-collar staff, he was simply a dedicated, overly quiet, single father who lived for the weekends he spent with his 9-year-old daughter, Ellie. Every single day without fail, Nathan would carefully pack a small plastic lunchbox for Ellie, slipping a handwritten note inside filled with hand-drawn sketches of stars and constellations, before walking her to the bus stop and then heading to his grueling hourly shift. What nobody at Pierce Global knew, because Nathan never spoke of his past, was that those delicate hands had once held a prestigious chair in historical industrial architecture and mechanical engineering at one of the nation's leading research universities. Years ago, his name had been celebrated in academic journals for his unparalleled ability to reconstruct ancient manufacturing methods and translate forgotten pre-industrial technical manuals. But 3 years prior, a sudden and devastating medical tragedy had claimed the life of his wife, leaving young Ellie deeply traumatized and in desperate need of a present, stable parent. Faced with the choice between endless academic travel, late-night research grants, and his daughter's fragile emotional well-being, Nathan made a silent, unhesitating sacrifice. He packed his advanced doctoral degrees into a dust-covered leather trunk in his attic, walked away from his tenure-track legacy, and took a predictable, low-stress warehouse job that guaranteed he could leave the facility at exactly 4 o'clock every afternoon to pick Ellie up from school. Meanwhile, 40 stories above the hum of the warehouse floor, Samantha Pierce was facing the greatest existential crisis of her professional career. Having inherited the multi-generational engineering empire from her visionary father, Samantha had aggressively pushed the company into the hyper-competitive world of automated aerospace manufacturing, securing a highly publicized $3 billion tentative contract with a consortium of Swiss and German investors. The entire deal rested upon the successful development of a new flagship titanium turbine blade, a revolutionary design that promised to alter global aviation. However, for the past 6 consecutive months, the advanced prototype blades had failed every single automated stress test, developing microscopic structural fractures during the rapid cooling phase of production. The board of directors was growing deeply impatient, openly questioning Samantha's leadership and threatening to force her out if the upcoming live demonstration failed. In her desperation to save her father's legacy, Samantha placed her complete unwavering trust in Julian Vance, a smooth-talking, highly credentialed executive vice president whom she had hired away from a rival firm at an exorbitant salary. Julian was the epitome of modern corporate prestige, boasting a resume filled with elite degrees and relying heavily on flashy multi-million-dollar digital simulations to mask his lack of practical, hands-on engineering experience. Julian assured Samantha that the systemic failure was simply a software glitch that could be ironed out by purchasing more expensive, automated machinery from his former employers, completely ignoring the fundamental physical laws governing the raw materials. But as the winter frost began to settle over the industrial park, a single misplaced spreadsheet would soon force Nathan's quiet sanctuary into the direct line of fire. 3 weeks later, the corporate world would come knocking on the warehouse floor. The high-pitched, agonizing whine of the stress testing chambers echoed through the reinforced glass walls of the primary engineering lab, creating a palpable sense of dread among the technicians gathered on the observation deck. Nathan Cole stood just outside the laboratory perimeter, holding a routine inventory log for the replacement thermal coils that Julian Vance had ordered at an astronomical expense to the company. Looking through the thick observation window, Nathan's sharp eyes immediately bypassed the blinking digital monitors and focused directly on the physical behavior of the molten titanium alloy as it flowed into the precision casting molds. With his profound, hidden background in historical metallurgy, Nathan instantly recognized that the automated system was forcing the metal through an unnaturally accelerated cooling cycle, a critical error that fundamentally misunderstood the material's thermal crystallization properties. He knew with absolute certainty that no matter how many millions of dollars Julian spent on advanced software updates, the structural integrity of the blades would continue to shatter from the inside out, because the fundamental physics of the heat distribution were being ignored. Desiring only to protect the safety of the facility and prevent a catastrophic failure that could cost hundreds of ordinary assembly line workers their livelihoods, Nathan quietly approached the senior floor manager, Marcus. Marcus was a seasoned, gray-haired supervisor who had worked for the Pierce family for over 25 years, an honest man who had occasionally noticed Nathan's unusual technical insights, but remained far too terrified of losing his own retirement pension under Julian Vance's increasingly ruthless corporate regime. Nathan gently handed Marcus a small, neatly written page torn from his notebook, detailing the exact preheating intervals and extended thermal cooling gradients required to stabilize the alloy, asking Marcus to pass it along to the engineering team. Marcus looked at the paper, his eyes widening slightly at the depth of the calculations, but he nervously shook his head and warned Nathan to keep his head down, telling him that Julian Vance did not take kindly to hourly warehouse workers questioning his expensive computer-guided methodologies. The very next morning, that quiet warning manifested into a devastating public confrontation. Julian Vance had discovered the anonymous technical note left on the laboratory desk, and instead of disregarding it, he chose to use it as a weapon to stage a calculated demonstration of absolute corporate authority. During a high-profile morning inspection where Samantha Pierce was walking the assembly floor alongside several influential board members, Julian abruptly halted the procession right in front of Warehouse Sector 4, calling Nathan forward by his employee number in front of dozens of his peers. Julian held up the crumpled piece of notebook paper, his voice dripping with a polished, corporate condescension as he mockingly read Nathan's meticulously calculated thermal formulas aloud, laughing that a mere box counter who earned hourly wages suddenly believed he possessed a superior understanding of aerospace metallurgy than a team of elite, university-certified specialists. The surrounding executives snickered on cue, while Julian continued to ruthlessly dismantle Nathan's character, accusing him of wasting valuable company time, creating unauthorized distractions on the production floor, and demonstrating an unacceptable level of insubordination that threatened the strict hierarchy of the corporation. Throughout the entire agonizing ordeal, Nathan stood perfectly still, his posture composed, his hands resting quietly at his sides, and his face an unreadable mask of calm dignity. He did not offer a single defensive remark, nor did he raise his voice to explain his credentials, knowing that reacting with anger would only jeopardize his employment and disrupt the stable, peaceful life he had fought so hard to provide for his daughter, Ellie. Samantha Pierce stood at the center of the executive group, her face pale from exhaustion and her mind consumed by the crushing weight of the looming billion-dollar contract deadline. Looking down at Nathan's faded uniform, she failed to see the profound intellect hidden beneath the surface, viewing him only through the lens of Julian's dismissive narrative as an unwanted distraction during a critical corporate crisis. Desperate to project absolute control and unwavering decisiveness to the skeptical board members flanking her, Samantha stepped forward and coldly told Nathan that his sole responsibility in this company was to move inventory, not to think or express imagination, and that if he could not contain his ideas to the loading dock, she would immediately find someone who could. With a wave of her hand, she authorized Julian to issue an immediate, indefinite suspension, effectively banishing Nathan from the property. Nathan simply nodded his head in respectful silence, walked back to his locker to pack his few personal belongings into a small cardboard box, and exited the facility into a cold, torrential downpour. As Nathan walked away from the only livelihood keeping his small family afloat, it reminds us of how often the most dedicated souls are pushed aside by those who look only at labels and titles. If you have ever experienced a moment in your own life where your hard work was ignored or your voice was silenced by the arrogance of others, please let us know in the comments below, so we can remind each other that our true value never depends on the approval of a broken system. Standing alone in the rain with his personal effects packed into a single cardboard box, Nathan knew the numbers were already counting down to a catastrophic failure. Exactly 48 hours would pass before the cracks in the foundation became impossible to hide. The silence that blanketed the executive office suite at midnight was heavy and suffocating, illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of a laptop screen reflecting off Samantha Pierce's exhausted eyes. 2 weeks had passed since Nathan Cole's quiet departure, and Julian Vance's highly publicized, million-dollar automated solution had just been put to the test during an exclusive, closed-door trial run for the primary international investment delegation. The result had been an unmitigated, catastrophic disaster. Under the intense stress of the automated cooling spray, the prototype turbine blade had fractured violently inside the multi-million-dollar testing chamber, sending metal shrapnel tearing through the sensitive calibration sensors and triggering a facility-wide emergency shutdown. The Swiss and German investors had left the facility in an uproar, issuing an absolute non-negotiable ultimatum. Samantha had exactly 48 hours to identify and correct the structural flaw in the casting process, or they would permanently withdraw their $3 billion funding, a catastrophic blow that would inevitably force Pierce Global into immediate bankruptcy and erase her father's life's work. As Samantha sat alone in the darkness, her head buried in her hands, her brilliant young lead data analyst, Chloe, knocked softly on the door and stepped into the room holding a weathered, locked leather case. Chloe, who served as the company's unsung evidence finder, carefully placed the case on the desk, explaining that the international delegation had left behind an archival, centuries-old handwritten journal belonging to the company's original European founder, believing it contained the lost foundational secret to stabilizing the alloy under extreme thermal shifts. Chloe admitted that every top university linguistics department they contacted had flatly refused to touch the manuscript, claiming that the text was written in an incredibly rare, obsolete blend of regional mining shorthand and ancient alchemical symbols that was entirely unreadable to modern scholars. However, Chloe's voice trembled slightly with a mixture of excitement and hesitation as she opened a secondary digital file on her tablet, revealing a startling discovery she had made while auditing the human resources database during the facility shutdown. Chloe explained that the quiet warehouse clerk whom they had so ruthlessly humiliated and suspended 2 weeks prior, Nathan Cole, was not an ordinary laborer at all. Her deep background check revealed that before dropping entirely off the grid 3 years ago, Dr. Nathan Cole had been the nation's leading academic authority on pre-industrial mechanical engineering and historical metallurgy, possessing a globally recognized expertise in deciphering the exact archaic dialects used in the Founder's Journal. A profound wave of realization, accompanied by a heavy, suffocating blanket of guilt, washed over Samantha as she stared at the academic credentials on the screen. Suddenly, remembering the absolute composure, the steady voice, and the unbreakable dignity Nathan had displayed while being publicly torn apart by Julian Vance on the warehouse floor, she realized with absolute clarity that in her blind pursuit of corporate prestige and credentialed arrogance, she had allowed her own desperation to silence the one man who actually possessed the answers to save her empire. This raises a question that many in our community often debate: whether a man of such immense talent should have broken his silence much sooner to prevent a disaster, or whether his absolute dedication to enduring the humiliation quietly was the only honorable way to shield his young daughter from the toxic storms of corporate greed. Driven by an urgent, overwhelming need to rectify her massive mistake, Samantha bypassed her security detail, obtained Nathan's modest residential address from the HR files, and drove herself out to a quiet, working-class suburb on the outskirts of the city. When she arrived at the small, neatly kept house, the porch light was burning softly, casting a warm glow over a row of potted flowers. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding with an uncharacteristic nervousness, and was greeted by Nathan, who was wearing a simple faded apron and holding a fifth-grade mathematics textbook he had been studying with his daughter, Ellie, who was peering curiously from behind the kitchen counter. Samantha, standing on the humble porch in her expensive designer coat, looked at the man she had so coldly dismissed and felt her corporate armor completely dissolve. She immediately offered a breathless, formal apology, promising him an instantaneous reinstatement, a massive $500,000 corporate consulting bonus, and a premier corner office in the executive tower if he would agree to return to the facility and translate the founder's manuscript to fix the failing assembly line. Nathan listened to her frantic offer with the exact same calm, unhurried stillness that he possessed in the warehouse, politely inviting her inside and pouring her a simple cup of tea before quietly declining the immense financial offer. He looked Samantha directly in the eyes and softly stated his real conditions. He explained that he had absolutely no desire for corporate titles, wealth, or corner offices, as his life belonged to his daughter, but he would agree to translate the document on 2 strict, non-negotiable conditions. First, Samantha had to provide a legally binding, written guarantee ensuring the absolute job security and permanent protection of every single hourly warehouse worker and assembly line laborer, ensuring they would not be scapegoated or laid off for Julian Vance's multi-million-dollar executive blunders. Second, she had to commit to a fundamental transformation of her own leadership, stripping away the toxic corporate hierarchy and learning to value the human dignity and practical wisdom of the workers on the lowest floors. Looking into the eyes of the woman who held his entire future in her hands, Nathan gave his final terms, unaware that the clock was already ticking toward an irreversible disaster. The next morning at exactly 6 o'clock, the high-pressure doors of the main assembly plant would open to a reality none of them were prepared to face. The atmosphere inside the grand executive boardroom had reached a fever pitch the following morning, as the international investment delegation sat alongside the full board of directors, their expressions cold and unforgiving as the final countdown to the contract termination approached. Julian Vance stood at the front of the room, desperately adjusting his silk tie as his glossy slideshow presentation attempted to deflect blame onto faulty raw material suppliers and unpredictable thermal anomalies. Suddenly, the heavy double doors swung open, and Samantha Pierce entered the room, flanked not by an entourage of high-priced corporate consultants, but by Nathan Cole, who was wearing his standard, neatly pressed warehouse uniform and carrying the weathered leather case containing the founder's ancient manuscript. Julian Vance let out a sharp, arrogant laugh in front of the entire assembly, loudly demanding to know why a suspended, blue-collar box mover was being brought into a high-stakes billionaire negotiation, mockingly repeating his assertion that the manuscript was an unreadable relic. Samantha silenced Julian with a single icy glare, stepping forward to announce to the board that Nathan was there under her personal authority as the primary technical advisor to the chief executive officer. It was in this exact high-pressure theater that the fateful confrontation occurred, as Julian, cornered by his own incompetence and desperate to maintain his deception, arrogantly challenged Nathan, loudly declaring that if a common warehouse laborer could translate a text that had baffled the finest linguistic minds in the country, he would personally resign on the spot. Samantha, matching the intense energy of the room while testing Nathan's ultimate resolve, looked toward him and delivered the challenging line, telling him to translate it, and she would personally guarantee his entire career's salary out of her own pocket. Nathan stepped forward to the mahogany table with an absolute grounded serenity that immediately commanded the room's attention. He carefully opened the yellowed pages of the centuries-old manuscript, his eyes scanning the intricate, faded script before he began to read aloud with flawless, unhesitating clarity. He revealed that the text was written in an archaic, regional Saxon metallurgy dialect that utilized specific, non-linear geometric symbols to represent molecular heat transfer. As Nathan translated the fluid prose, he exposed the profound historical secret that the company's original founder had discovered over 200 years ago. The titanium alloy could never be stabilized using modern rapid automated cooling sprays, because the rapid temperature drop caused a destructive crystalline alignment. Instead, the manuscript detailed a precise gradual thermal cooling process that required a localized nitrogen pressurized environment maintained at an exact, unwavering temperature of 143 degrees Celsius during the critical transition phase. The lead German investor leaned forward, his mouth falling open in utter astonishment as Nathan accurately decoded the historical chemical ratios, instantly recognizing that this forgotten pre-industrial wisdom was the exact key to unlocking a flawless, micro-fracture-free manufacturing process worth billions of dollars in modern patents. Julian Vance's face turned a deep, panicked shade of crimson as his entire multi-million-dollar digital simulation narrative evaporated into thin air in a matter of minutes. Before Julian could utter a single defensive word, Chloe, the sharp evidence finder, stepped forward and connected her master tablet to the boardroom's main projection screens, revealing a definitive sequence of internal server logs she had uncovered during the morning automated audit. The screens clearly displayed that Julian Vance had deliberately altered the baseline data of the previous stress tests, consciously covering up the initial manufacturing warnings and falsifying the software reports in order to justify the purchase of millions of dollars of unnecessary automated machinery from a private equipment company in which he secretly held substantial financial shares. A collective gasp echoed through the boardroom as Julian's elaborate, self-serving corporate fraud was laid completely bare in front of the maximum number of corporate witnesses. Julian began to stammer, his polished corporate language completely failing him as he looked around the room and realized he was utterly cornered by the undeniable mathematical and historical truth. Samantha stood perfectly still, watching the absolute unraveling of the deceptive hierarchy that had nearly destroyed her father's legacy, her gaze locked onto Nathan, whose quiet restraint and refusal to gloat or seek revenge served as the ultimate devastating payoff to everyone who had underestimated him. As the polished corporate facade finally shattered around them, the true architect of the company's future stood revealed in the flashing lights of the emergency monitors. 12 hours later, the final judgment would be delivered in the one room where truth could no longer be bought. The morning sun streamed through the expansive glass windows of the primary assembly facility, illuminating a massive gathering of hundreds of warehouse clerks, technicians, and floor laborers who had been called together for an unprecedented, mandatory company-wide address. Samantha Pierce stood on a raised platform at the center of the manufacturing floor, the full board of directors and the international investment delegation standing quietly behind her. With absolute clarity and a voice that carried a newfound depth of humility, Samantha spoke directly into the microphone, publicly acknowledging that the company had been saved from total ruin not by expensive external consultants or automated algorithms, but by the profound brilliance and silent sacrifice of one of their own warehouse team members. In front of the entire assembled workforce, she formally announced the immediate, permanent termination and legal prosecution of Julian Vance for corporate fraud, followed by the immediate enactment of the legally binding worker protection contracts that Nathan had demanded. Samantha then turned to Nathan, who stood quietly near the back of the crowd in his standard uniform, and officially offered him the prestigious, high-paying corporate title of Chief Technology Officer, complete with a massive executive salary, stock options, and a seat on the board of directors. Nathan, maintaining his characteristic composure, stepped forward and politely declined the flashy executive title and the immense wealth. Instead, he requested the creation of a quietly meaningful, systemic role, the Director of Practical Engineering and Worker Mentorship, a position that allowed him to work directly on the shop floor, bridging the gap between theoretical design and the manual wisdom of the laborers, while strictly preserving his predictable 9-to-5 hours so he could remain a completely present, devoted father for his daughter, Ellie. The entire warehouse floor erupted into a deafening, emotional roar of applause, his fellow clerks stepping forward to warmly embrace the quiet hero who had leveraged his own moment of supreme vindication to protect the livelihoods of everyone around him. 9 months would pass before the frantic energy of that historic corporate turning point finally settled into a beautiful, enduring rhythm of life. An ordinary sun-drenched Saturday afternoon found Nathan sitting on a wooden bench at a vibrant neighborhood park, watching with a peaceful smile as Ellie, now wearing a bright blue jacket, laughed joyfully while running through the green grass with her school friends. A soft footstep on the gravel path announced the arrival of Samantha Pierce, who was dressed in a casual sweater, her face completely free of the intense, hyper-pressured stress that had once defined her life. Over the past several months of working closely together to rebuild the facility's manufacturing foundations, the long hours spent sharing ideas, reviewing historical texts, and respecting each other's worlds had naturally and beautifully evolved into a deep, genuine mutual affection and love. Samantha sat down quietly beside Nathan on the bench, handing him a warm cup of coffee and looking out at the children playing in the park. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, beautifully restored historical compass that had belonged to the company's original founder, handing it to Nathan as a quiet symbol of the true direction his humility had brought back to her life. Nathan took the compass, his calloused fingers tracing the polished brass edges, and shared a quiet, unspoken look of deep understanding with Samantha, knowing that real worth was never found in the noisy, arrogant pursuit of corporate power, but in the quiet protection of family, the preservation of truth, and the dignity of the honest work that connects us all. Has someone in your own life ever been misjudged the way Nathan was? Written off and underestimated before anyone bothered to really see the brilliance and sacrifice they carried inside? Tell us about them in the comments, even if it's just to finally give them the credit they deserved all along. If you believe that quiet, overlooked people deserve to be seen and honored for their true character, we warmly invite you to subscribe and join our family here, staying with us for the journeys and the final truths that remind us of what truly matters in this life.